Hello, we're rolling into another episode of the DRH show. As usual, I talk to interesting people within psychology, mental health, and well-being. Today, I'm joined by a counselor and therapist. He's also the co-founder of Talk to the Rainbow, Hugo Minchin. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Dennis. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you here, Hugo. Let's start off with you telling us your backstory, your trajectory in life, and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
Where to start? So I'm half French, half Australian, but grew up in London. And my original professional background is actually very different to therapy. I was trained in corporate PR and worked in the City of London for many years before becoming, transferring over to becoming a therapist. And the reason I decided to study to become a therapist is I experienced my own set of mental health issues and did quite intensive therapy at the time, which was very useful for me. And through that therapy, I got interested in the process of the therapy itself, not just seeing the results, but why I was seeing those results and why the therapist I was working with at the time was doing what they were doing. So that's really what ignited the flame of passion towards therapy. And so I decided to train as a therapist. It happened quite organically. And then moved to Bristol, where I worked in an addiction unit for substance misuse unit and started private practice. And that then eventually evolved into me launching Talk to the Rainbow, which is an LGBTQ plus specific service, LGBTQ plus in a much wider sense of the word. So that's, in a nutshell, that's my journey and how I'm here sitting talking to you today, really.
Thank you. And of course, one aspect of what you do, you're a therapist and you're founder of Talk to the Rainbow. As a therapist, I understand that you really focus on integrative counseling. So if you could just give us like an overview of what form of approach is that, and also if you could just share to us what's the strength and limitations of that approach.
Absolutely. So I describe myself as an integrative relational counsellor, and by that I mean is central to my work is the relationship with my client. I believe it's through establishing a working alliance with my clients that works for them, that therapy really affects change. In terms of integration, it's I've been trained in lots of various different approaches to therapy, the traditional models that I use in various different combinations depending on a client. So it's very much client-led and responding to what the client needs rather than a one-size-fits-all approach. And that's what I mean in terms of integrating my practice. It's bringing together different theories, different schools of thought that I studied and that I've used. Also lived experience of what works for clients, communicating that with the client and sort of co-creating the therapy with the client so that it's really unique and genuine to them. And I think it's got a real strength because it's got a real diversity, it's got a real ability to be flexible and to really respond to a client's need, which I think is really important. But it's an integration that comes with thought and process and underpinned by solid kind of theoretical basis. And I think that's the important bit in integration, is that it has to make coherent sense. It's not just picking here and there bits and pieces and hoping that it will work. It's part of looking at a client as a whole and thinking, what kind of therapy is going to work here in combination together, but focusing on the relational as a sort of thing that brings it all together, how it was working between myself and a client and vice versa.
And what is the limitation? What are the limitations of this approach?
If done very well, there are very few limitations because I think that it covers many bases. I think that where there's limitations is when perhaps practitioners, as I've just described, choose bits and pieces from therapy without the thought of the therapeutic journey as a whole. And then that's not so much integrative as it would be elective. So it's sort of a toolbox where you randomly choose different tools in the hope that it would work, rather than viewing the project as a whole and thinking, what tools do I need to help this project, whatever it might be. Not that I view my clients as a project, but as an analogy, that's how I would describe it.
And so what's your area of specializations, Hugo? You mentioned earlier that you work with substance misuse. What else do you work with?
Yeah, so I'd worked for some years in substance misuse. Obviously, my work with Talk to the Rainbow involves an awful lot of work with the LGBTQ plus community and issues that are relevant to them. So these are mental health issues that are relevant across the board to, to lots of different communities, but they seem to be magnified within the LGBTQ plus community. So that's issues around anxiety, often shame, internalized homophobia, substance misuse plays a part. But dealing with it from a sort of LGBTQ plus lived experience, all our therapists are part of the LGBTQ plus umbrella. So that's an area that we specialize in. But what I love about being a therapist is I get to work with such a wide variety of different people who are showing human behaviors, human emotions, human issues, and no two clients are the same. And so it's very difficult to narrow it down to one area, because I've dealt with trauma, I've dealt with children and young people. So every experience for me is unique and individual. So it's a very broad.
It's a very broad approach. Now you mentioned you work with different clients, you work with different issues, but if you could just give us a snapshot, what's your normal mode of working? Do you work online? Do you work face to face? Well, obviously with COVID-19, I would understand, but you work online. But pre-COVID-19, how do you usually work with a certain client?
So traditionally, I've worked face to face, and it's either been just myself and a client, or as part of a multi-agency approach for certain clients. As a team, we certainly offer that as an approach. If there's a client that needs specifically different types of interventions, we can bring together that as a team. But obviously with COVID, everything did have to move virtual, and we started moving virtually sort of quite early on before the lockdown in anticipation that this was coming. And what we're finding is that that's a medium that, whilst it's not the same, has been working really well. And we've had a lot of clients that have started therapy with us, and myself, and with me included, who've never experienced face-to-face therapy. And actually this, like you and I are talking now, is their first experience of therapy. And we found, and the feedback that we've been getting from clients and therapists is that, or our therapists anyway, is that we're able to establish a really good therapeutic way of working together. But it needs some thought. It's more than just let's open Skype. It needs different boundaries, it needs different context, it needs some kind of a coordinated approach to make it impactful. But the reality is that for a lot of people, having all these therapists now online has been a real advantage, because you have people that live in more rural areas who might not have access to therapists anyway, being able to access therapy for the first time. People with mobility issues where it's really difficult to find a therapy room that's disabled access, for example, suddenly finding that, the therapeutic world has opened up for them. And for anyone, it's less, since geography isn't an issue, until at least September, when we're planning to resume face-to-face, possibly if things have stabilized enough. It's now less about who I can get access to directly face-to-face, but who is right for me. And that person could be anywhere, potentially anywhere in the world at this point. But we recognize it's not for every client, and some clients want to wait until things go back to face-to-face, and that's also fine.
You mentioned that it's not for every client, and of course that's understandable. This reminds me of a previous conversation with a lecturer from Australia, Dr. Nathan Eva, and I asked him that is it because of COVID-19 that we will be more open to the idea of doing things online. So do you see that happening from a counseling perspective, that because of COVID-19 people will realize, like, hang on, we can actually do this thing online, and I should be more familiar with this, I should be more comfortable with this? Do you see that happening, or do you think people will still lean towards a face-to-face kind of interaction?
I think that very much so. Certainly, we as a team have discovered that online is really effective. We've done some really good work online, and our clients have found it really. Some clients have found it really effective. And the reality is, the counselling and psychotherapeutic world has been for generations quite traditional and quite slow to adapt to the modern world in terms of online therapy. It has been around for a while, but was always viewed as not as effective, or not quite, the proper kind of therapy. Whereas actually what we're finding is, if you put it together properly and you've got the right kind of contracting, the right boundaries, it can work really well. And so I don't see why we can't now have a mixture of both. And in fact, many of our therapists, including myself, are thinking of allocating times or days where they will continue online therapy, because I know some of our clients will want to remain online even when they have the possibility of going face to face, because it's easier, or they feel more at ease. Their home is their safe space, or they may be too anxious to leave the flat, or unable to leave the flat for whatever reason, or their home. So it has a lot of advantages, and I think it would be wrong for us to roll back the clock, because I don't think we can now.
Now, Hugo, let's move on to another aspect of what you do. You also mentioned that you work with Talk to the Rainbow, and of course, I spoke to Tara Fraser, who is also one of the guests at DRH show. So, could you tell us more about Talk to the Rainbow? What's the aim, and what sort of problems that you help with, sort of issues that you help people with, LGBT?
So I founded Tara. You're right, interviewed some time ago. Tara and I worked together at the same addiction unit, and we decided initially the idea was just her and I working together. And in recognition of the need that actually the LGBTQ plus community had for therapy, in terms of the amount of mental health issues the community was facing, and the difficulty the community was finding in accessing therapy. And I don't mean in accessing any kind of therapist, but in accessing therapists that had lived experience similar to their own, be that a trans therapist, be that a gay therapist, someone that at least had some kind of lived experience of what they might have experienced, or the issues that they might be facing. And our aim really in setting this up, and it snowballed into something really much bigger, because the feedback was so positive, and members of the therapeutic community were really keen to get involved. And we've got a really diverse and exciting team of all sorts of different therapists, from clinical psychologists to, we've recently taken on a play therapist who works with really young children about gender identity. It grew organically in response to demand, and in response to, we knew of people that were traveling to London from Bristol every week to access the right kind of therapy. And in our training, we also realized that there were very few LGBTQ plus or openly LGBTQ plus therapists training. So there is that gap. And the community is in such a difficult situation, mental health wise, that it's a gap that we felt we sort of had a duty to fill.
I think I have to ask this. Aside from Tara Fraser, I also interviewed Debbie Hayton, and I'm quite sure that you've heard of Debbie. And what's your sort of, shall we say, for lack of a better term, argument for people like Debbie Hayton, who's got different orientation about this topic, especially she said that trans women are men. So how would you address that?
So it's not really, as a therapist, it's not really my place to comment on what's going on for Dr. Hayton in terms of her own process to come to that kind of narrative. But speaking to my trans colleagues and friends in the trans community, it's a narrative that causes them quite a lot of concern. It's a narrative that causes them concern for two reasons, really. On the one hand, because it's a narrative that's seen as a go-to voice for the trans community, as representative of the trans community, which it really isn't. And on the other side, because as therapists, we see someone struggling with their identity, with their sense of self. So our hearts kind of wants to help people in that place. So that's really what my observations would be around comments that Dr. Hayton has made.
Now, I'm asking you as the founder of Talk to the Rainbow. So obviously, this is a rather sensitive issue. This is there's a lot of nuance, and this is a multi-layered issue. Another thing that I also want to ask you is, you've probably heard that, you know, in 2020, transgender women will be allowed to compete in women's sports, and we're not even sure if the Olympics is going to push through because of COVID-19, but if it pushed through, transgender women will be allowed to compete, and that's already a provocative issue. A lot of people are not open about the idea, and also, of course, there's J.K. Rowling, who's been, you know, she's been rather defensive of her, you know, stance about trans women. So, how do you think, as a founder of an LGBT organization, how do you think we should approach this issue on a societal level?
Well, I mean, these are very valid questions to ask. I think that any move towards integration should be welcomed with open arms. And I know of sports teams that have done this very successfully. But I think we need to move the conversation on, really, from this. And as you're right, society has to take a much harder look at itself. At our ability to accept, at our ability to tolerate, at how much we are allowing other people to be their genuine selves and how much we're able to accept them for who they are. Because the reality is my team and I deal with the psychological trauma day in, day out, that this constant attack and vitriol and discrimination leveled at the trans community is creating. People are literally losing the will to live as a result. And I think that's a much more valuable focus of people's attention and a much more important conversation to be had.
Now, you mentioned that there's still a lot of discrimination towards LGBT. Now, as a therapist, do you think it's generally advisable that you come out in the workplace, or should you rather keep it to yourself so you could avoid discrimination?
I think coming out in the workplace is a very personal decision. I think I admire those that have, and there have been various prominent business leaders that have done so recently, and media figures and sports people increasingly. And I think that's a very positive move, to have as many positive role models as possible for the community to look up to. But the act of coming out in itself is very personal, and no one should feel forced to come out in the workplace. Having said that, where for me the duty lies is in businesses, companies, organizations, providing the environment where people, for any number of reasons, whether it's because of their race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender identity, feel comfortable enough to be themselves. But that doesn't necessarily require coming out for that environment to be in place. That remains the individual's decision. But where our responsibility lies is in creating environments that are comfortable enough and tolerant enough for that to happen, should an individual wish to do so.
Do you think that we're still not tolerant with LGBT people?
I think we have made progress, but I'm very cautious in saying progress because there's still a long way to go. And progress can often be used as a way of saying, oh, you've got what you wanted now. The reality is many members of the LGBTQ plus community in many different contexts are treated very differently. And if you've got, you know, especially an outlier would be the trans community, where levels of discrimination are obscenely high and remain obscenely high. If you're part of the BAME community and trans, even more so. So you've got a lot of intersectionalities, and the LGBTQ plus community as a whole is facing, even just on a society discourse, day in, day out, there is a level of discrimination. The fact that we have to even ask, is it worth coming out in the workplace to face discrimination? That question is very indicative of the calculation people have to make. If I come out, how will this be received? Now that tells you everything about just that workplace in particular, for example, about their levels, if someone is not safe enough to just be themselves. And even the fact that we have to come out in the first place implies a level of, right, this is me revealing myself for who I am. And opening oneself up to discrimination. And we've seen this online in our articles that have been posted, you know, every time there's negative feedback, there are people that come in, oh, why are they, you know, for example, why are the gays speaking out? Again, what's the gay agenda? Well, there's no agenda here. It's just about equality, equity, tolerance. It's a long way to go. Progress is being made, and hopefully this whole movement around Black Lives Matter, around kind of social awareness of difference and discrimination, will have an impact. But in certain areas of the country, more than others, there's a lot that needs to change still.
Sorry, go ahead. No. I just want to pick up on what you said about intersectionality, because I've read one of your pieces, one of the pieces that you've written. You said that the coronavirus pandemic raised the LGBT and the mental health crisis that they're experiencing. Would you care to explain that more? I think you already alluded to that, but could you explain it more? Why is it that the pandemic has sort of, you know, make it more worse for LGBT people?
Sure. I think that the LGBTQ plus community was already suffering a growing mental health crisis at the same time as LGBTQ plus support was being stripped of funds, stripped of of the ability to support the community. And that's partly why Talk to the Rainbow came about, because you know, the services that exist are literally cracking at the seams. The community itself is more prone to isolation generally, more prone to living by themselves, more prone to not have close family ties. The trans community is very reliant on medical support for transition. So already, you know, levels of anxiety, suicide are much higher pre-COVID. So you impose something like COVID in on the situation, and the increase of isolation, whereby a lot of people within the community rely on safe spaces that are now shut, or on friends as a second family. The ability to be together, the ability to be united, the ability to feel that support from other people who relate to you and who you can relate to is really important. As well as, for example, for the trans community, the lack of access to the medication that they need to complete their transition. So it's a massive abrupt halt for many, which is deeply traumatic. And you know, now we're looking at, the WHO has recently said that there might be problems in supplies of antiviral medications for those living with HIV, which is obviously by no means a LGBTQ plus only specific, but it will impact those in the community that have HIV or that are HIV positive, or it may do, I hope it doesn't, but it's a possibility there. So we're not saying that it's only the LGBTQ plus community that is affected by this. We all are, the whole community, you know, the whole of the UK, the whole of the world in a way. But there are certain outlying groups already vulnerable to mental health issues, and the BAME community is another prime example of this, that are suffering already more than the general population. And then you add COVID into that mix and it really does become a crisis. And it's a crisis that we're already seeing indications of. It hasn't yet, that wave hasn't yet arrived, but as therapists, we're looking at this thinking, this is going to come. you know.
Mhm. Mhm. So moving forward after the COVID-19 crisis is over, how do you think Talk to the Rainbow would, how would you support your members?
Our clients, or yeah.
Yeah, the LGBT community in general. How do you have any specific projects that you have in mind?
We do. We've got lots of projects, even during COVID. Obviously, our first project was to make our services accessible virtually, and I think that will continue. And we now have clients much further afield than the Southwest, so all over the UK, really. So that's been a project in itself. I think that our original idea, and it still remains, was to create a series of safe hubs in the major cities, of therapeutic safe hubs, so actual physical spaces where people could come, see their therapists, hold talks, really create those spaces for exchange and for mental health support, not just for the LGBTQ plus community, because we accept anyone. It's just differences that are celebrated at Talk to the Rainbow. So that's some plans. We've got some really creative plans. As I said, we've just taken on a play therapist who's also fluent in sign language. So we're looking at working with much younger children. We've got some strong links with organisations like Off the Record, working with children. Again, that's something that we're looking at. And I think that the community accessibility programs that we're planning are something we're going to work on very hard, because centre to our belief is to make therapy as accessible to as many people as possible. And we're working very hard in finding creative ways of making that happen, whilst still remaining afloat as an organisation.
Brilliant. Now, Hugo, we've learned a great deal about your work as one of the co-founders of Talk to the Rainbow, and also we had a snapshot of your work as a therapist. Now, let's move on to the more human side of Hugo. So, can you tell us what's you've done a lot of work on your area. So, what's the most important thing that you want the public to know about you as an individual, or about your work? What's the big message?
About me as an individual. Well, it's different. I suppose me as an individual is also me as a team of individuals, because we've all got a similar aim together, and we all have similar values, which is that there's no problem too different, too apparently weird, or too out there for us to be able to receive you without with non-judgmental kind of open arms. And I think that's core, because I think a lot of people feel embarrassed, feel like their problems don't quite fit the mold of the normal mental health issues that everyone talks about in the headlines, or that feel that there's no one that quite represents them, or no one that they can quite relate to. And that's the main message, is that we will find someone within the team that has lived experience and that you can relate to. And I think that's a really important message, because the therapeutic community as a whole is quite white, middle class, heteronormative. That's the reality in this country. Through its training, through just those in private practice, it remains like that. So that's the one of our core ethos, is not to be like that. So differences are welcome, whatever those differences may be.
Can you also, because you've been working for a long time within the therapeutic community, can you tell us some of the misconceptions about mental health that you've come across with, and I suppose try to address those misconceptions?
I mean, there are so many misconceptions out there, and there's great concern for me about how little mental health is understood. Although I know that we're going we are making improvements, and people are becoming much more aware of the mental health issues that people may face. But anything from it's your fault to it's their fault to can't they just take a pill to, whoever has a mental health issue is showing a sign of weakness. For me, in the work that I've done with my clients, I feel very privileged to witness some of the strongest individuals I've ever met who are struggling with mental health, sure, but are struggling through. And that for me is a display of strength beyond, beyond measure. And I keep feeling humbled by people's experiences of that. So if I use that as an example of a misconception, someone who has a mental health issue is showing weakness, I would fundamentally disagree. The fact that someone is struggling with a mental health shows more strength than most people will have to face in terms of getting through it, even getting through a day. That person has shown more strength and resilience than many people give them credit for.
Mm-hmm. Now, Hugo, a lot of people who will be watching this video, they're actually young people. A lot of my subscribers are students. So for those who want to follow your footsteps, who want to be, a therapist, who wants to work within the LGBT or any other cause, what would you recommend as a good resource or as a good starting point to learn more about mental health, to learn more about counseling? What would your recommendation be?
I think counsellors are generally pretty open people, and I wouldn't be afraid to go on the counselling directories and find counsellors that a student might think, oh, that person sounds interesting, and being quite honest and upfront and contacting them for advice. If you see a counsellor working in this specific area and a student thinks that's where I want to work, well, that sounds really interesting, to just go ahead and contact us. I've been in communication with students recently who have just been asking advice, right? We want to be working in the LGBTQ plus field. How do we do it? And it's a pleasure to respond to them because they are the industry's future. I think that COVID has shown that, a lot more people relying on kind of things at home. So there's a lot of apps. So the NHS, for example, has a great list of mental health apps, which are aimed at helping people, but also sources of information, sources of exchange. There are some really powerful Facebook groups for various different issues that have been created. So there are lots of different avenues. And then it's about finding a training provider that sort of fits or that feels like it fits for that student, and then taking it step by step. And therapeutic practice also doesn't have to, it's not like you start on day one and end. It can be done in stages, it can be varied, it can be dynamic. So it's about being a bit creative and seeing what sings for you as a student, I would say.
Is there a particular individual or a particular piece of work which has the greatest influence on how you approach things?
There are many individuals that have influenced me, but the most, I think, I could talk about theorists, I guess, but I think the most inspiring individuals are the people that I work with, because we have such a different range of professionals, highly skilled, but coming from anything from play therapists to dance therapists to clinical psychologists, and it's that meeting of minds, that exchange of information that for me has informed my more recent practice more than anything else. I get an awful lot from my trans colleagues, and I still have lots to learn about, because the LGBTQ plus umbrella is so diverse that you sit under the umbrella and yet still have a complete lack of understanding about certain things. So I get a lot of inspiration from my colleagues. I think they're fantastic, and I'd say that I get, in terms of influence on my work directly, they would have more day-to-day influence than anyone else.
And what do you think you would be doing if you didn't work as a therapist?
Oh, that's a really difficult question. I used to work in public relations, and I do still really enjoy that side of things. I found the creative selling a story side quite enjoyable. So I'd probably go back to a version of that. Yeah, probably something like that. But I also used to work while I was studying as a support worker, and I got a lot out of that for people, for vulnerable adults or adults with learning disabilities, and I found that really rewarding. So it might be a combination of both, maybe. I don't know. Yeah.
Someone who works with a PR agency and also supports, pretty much like Talk to the Rainbow, I suppose.
Yeah, kind of, because we do talk about issues. We made it part of our mission at the beginning that we see these, the devastation every day, the psychological trauma, and what we're not prepared to do is just sit back and pick up the pieces without saying, hey guys, have you seen what's happening here? Obviously, confidentiality is sacred, but issue-based, we're not afraid to get involved in the conversation.
Hugo, you work in a very stressful area. So how do you relax? What's your distressing outlet?
I do a lot of sports, although at the moment it's mainly at home. And I found that incredibly useful for me personally in terms of a way of getting rid of nervous energy, relaxing.
What's your sport?
I used to play rugby, but now it's more gym based. Well, now it's actually home based, just behind me. But the gym I get a lot out of, and it's a completely different world for me to therapy. Although there's a really important, for me, in my experience, there's a really important aspect between kind of body and mind connection, and how you feel in your body impacts how you feel in your psychologically. But something that takes me completely out of the therapy world, or just meeting friends who aren't therapists. I get a lot from that, where conversations don't have to be about psychology or analysis, or conversations can be about any number of different things, and that I find just gives me a pause away from thinking about human beings and humanity as a whole, really.
That's something I could relate to. So sometimes, because I work within mental health.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just want to take a break. I understand this is crucial, but I want to talk something else. Now, Hugo, where do you see yourself 10 years from now? And also, what's your plan, 10-year plan for Talk to the Rainbow?
So as I said, our plan involves expanding. We have done quite quickly in terms of the team that we have, but it's about creating safe therapeutic hubs across the country in areas where we feel that there is the need for it. And I think that's something that we would easily achievable within 10 years with the demand that there is. And to be a truly accessible service. So not only just a service that is able to stand on its own feet financially, which it is now, but a service that is offering a dynamic, creative service to the community. That's sort of my 10-year plan, really, or our 10-year plan. But it's really driven by the members of the team. So as I said, as new members of the team with different experiences join, it opens up different roads, and we're very open to it growing in many different ways. So it'll expand, but quite how it will have expanded in 10 years, I'm not quite sure.
And finally, Hugo, what else is in the pipeline? Any upcoming events for Talk to the Rainbow, or for yourself as a therapist?
So I think first thing coming up in the pipeline is us managing the transfer back to face-to-face. September. Face-to-face with some clients, not for all, as I said, and depending on the therapist and feasibility of it all. And then we can start working very hard on the projects that we had in the pipeline pre-COVID. So the creative kind of group work that we're really keen to do. We're really keen to do a lot more with local organisations and charities in terms of supporting them to deliver programs, supplying our expertise to them and vice versa. So we're looking at a lot more collaboration and expanding the team. I think Talk to the Rainbow is the team, really. So we're looking for people from all different walks of life, really, and all different specialisms within the mental health community to sort of consider joining if they have an interest in that, because it needs to be dynamic, it needs to be diverse, and we want to be able to offer a sort of full range of different approaches, techniques, so that a client can really have their whole therapeutic journey with us, whether it be because they need a support worker or because they need a traditional therapist.
Mhm. And Hugo, please tell us your website and where can we find you in social media, if you are in social media.
Yeah, we are on social media. So it's Talk to the Rainbow, all one word, on Facebook. So at Talk to the Rainbow.
Mhm.
And then it's www.talktotherrainbow.co.uk.
Mhm. And you also have your personal website as a therapist, right?
Yes, I do. And it's called talktohugo.co.uk.
You can't really mistake that. One is Talk to the Rainbow and one is Talk to Hugo. Well,
Exactly.
yeah, it's been an insightful conversation with you, Hugo. But unfortunately, our time is up. Thank you for sharing with us your time, your expertise, and of course, telling us all about Talk to the Rainbow. I look forward to hearing more about your work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dennis.